New Year's Eve, an occasion marked by joy, celebration, and anticipation. Across the world, millions gather under sparkling skies, their faces lit with hope for the coming year. Families unite, friends embrace, and strangers share fleeting moments of connection, all to the sound of countdowns and fireworks. But beneath the bright lights and revelry lies a different kind of night, a night when time stands still for just a moment, as if the universe holds its breath. For some, that pause is an invitation for forces we cannot see, for events we cannot explain, to make themselves known. And for one family, that night of hope turned into an unforgettable nightmare. This is their story. It begins in a quiet suburban town where the streets seem like any other. The decorations were up, the party plans were made, and the air hummed with the energy of a year about to end. But in a single moment, everything they thought they knew about their lives and safety would be questioned forever. Have you ever wondered what truly happens when the world lets its guard down, when laughter fades and the noise of celebration retreats, leaving only the silence of the unknown? Tonight, you're about to uncover a tale that will make you rethink the meaning of New Year's Eve traditions, a story where joy and terror collide in ways no one could have imagined. Before we begin, let me ask you, what's the scariest thing that has ever happened to you on New Year's Eve? A strange noise? A fleeting shadow? Share your stories in the comments because what you're about to hear may be closer to your reality than you think. For the Prescott family, New Year's Eve had always been a tradition. Nova Prescott, a 38-year-old teacher, loved the symbolism of starting anew. Her husband, Mark, a software engineer with a penchant for meticulous planning, saw it as the perfect time to recalibrate their family goals. And for their two children, 10-year-old Noah and 6-year-old Mia, it was about staying up late, watching fireworks, and savoring their mother's famous chocolate cake. But this year was different. The Prescotts had chosen to celebrate far from the bustling city they called home. Instead of joining their neighbors for the annual block party, they packed their bags and headed to an old family cabin nestled deep in the woods. Nova's parents had owned the cabin for decades, but in recent years, it had fallen into disrepair, used only sparingly for quiet getaways. The decision to spend New Year's Eve there wasn't random. Nova had wanted to revive the nostalgia of her childhood, to show her kids the beauty of a star-filled sky far from the city lights. Mark agreed, seeing it as a chance to disconnect and spend quality time together without distractions. The cabin was cozy but isolated, with a single winding road cutting through the dense forest to reach it. For the Prescotts, it was a chance to embrace simplicity, until simplicity became something far more complicated. But as idyllic as it seemed, the cabin carried its own history. Nova remembered spending summers there as a child, but she also recalled her mother's stern warnings: never to whistle after sunset, never to leave the cabin alone at night, and most importantly, to never let strangers inside. The warnings had seemed like harmless old wives' tales at the time, but now in the stillness of the forest, they resurfaced in Nova's mind with unexpected clarity. Mark, ever the skeptic, dismissed her concerns. He had checked the property thoroughly and assured Nova that everything was in order. But small things began to unsettle her. The faint sound of footsteps on the cabin roof when they first arrived. The way the light in the upstairs hallway flickered no matter how many times Mark adjusted it. And the old grandfather clock in the corner, silent for years, suddenly ticking as they unpacked. Noah and Mia were less concerned with the cabin's quirks and more excited about the adventure of being in the woods. But even Noah, usually fearless, asked Nova why the birds outside the cabin seemed so quiet. "It's winter," Nova had replied. "They're just resting." Still, she couldn't explain why her own unease was growing. "Do you believe in New Year's Eve superstitions? Like not leaving the house after dark or eating certain foods for good luck?" The Prescotts thought they were just stories. But what if they weren't? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As the evening stretched on, the Prescotts settled into the rhythm of their New Year's Eve celebration. Dinner was simple but comforting. Homemade pasta by Nova, followed by laughter as the family reminisced about the highlights of their year. Outside, the forest grew darker, the tall pines swaying slightly in the cold wind, their movements almost imperceptible through the frosted windows. At first, the oddities seemed minor, quirks of an old cabin weathered by time. When Noah ran back to the living room after playing upstairs, he paused and asked his mother why his toy train had moved to the windowsill. Nova brushed it off, assuming he had simply forgotten placing it there. Mark teased her for being overly cautious when she asked him to double-check the front door lock. But in the silence that followed dinner, something changed. The first sound was faint, so faint that Nova thought she had imagined it. A whisper, soft but insistent, seemed to drift down from the staircase. She looked up, expecting to see Noah or Mia at the top of the stairs, but the hallway above was empty. She opened her mouth to say something, but stopped herself. It was just her imagination, she told herself. But then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They moved across the upstairs floorboards above the living room. Mark looked up from his book, his brow furrowing. "Probably just the wind," he said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that Nova didn't miss. When the power flickered moments later, the entire family froze. The lights dimmed for a heartbeat, then surged back to life. Mia, who had been carefully arranging her cards into a pyramid, looked up and asked, "Why does the cabin keep doing that?" Nova offered a weak smile and told her it was just an old house, but she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Noah was the next to notice something strange. "Where's Mr. Fluffles?" he asked, referring to the stuffed bear he had brought upstairs earlier. Nova told him to check his room, but when he returned, his face was pale. "It's gone," he said. "It was on my bed, and now it's not there." Mark suggested he had simply misplaced it, but Nova couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the Prescotts tried to carry on. Mark suggested a round of charades to distract the kids, but even he kept glancing toward the staircase, as if expecting someone or something to appear. When Nova went to refill their mugs of cocoa, she noticed something chilling. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped ticking, its hands frozen at 11:11. She called Mark over, but when he inspected it, the clock began ticking again. The Prescotts weren't entirely alone, though. Earlier that afternoon, they had seen a man walking along the road toward the cabin. He had waved but didn't approach, disappearing into the forest without a word. Now Nova wondered if he might still be nearby. "Maybe he's just passing through," Mark had said. But Nova couldn't shake the image of his face, weathered, blank, and slightly too long, as if he were wearing a mask. When Mark suggested checking outside to ease everyone's nerves, Nova protested. She didn't want him leaving the cabin, not even for a moment. "There's nothing out there," Mark insisted, grabbing a flashlight. But as he opened the front door, a gust of icy wind blew out the candles on the dining table. Mia screamed, and Mark quickly shut the door again, his face pale. "Have you ever had a moment where you felt something was wrong, but couldn't explain why? What did you do? Let me know in the comments." The Prescotts tried to dismiss the feeling, but what happened next would make it impossible to ignore. As the minutes ticked closer to midnight, the tension inside the cabin became almost unbearable. The Prescotts were no longer laughing, no longer pretending the strange occurrences were a coincidence. Nova, normally the steady presence in any storm, found herself gripping the edge of the couch, her eyes darting to every shadow that flickered across the walls. Mark, who prided himself on being the family protector, felt an unfamiliar knot of dread forming in his stomach. And then it happened. Something none of them could explain, something they would never forget. It began with a sound, a voice, low and indistinct, but unmistakably human. It came from upstairs, drifting down the staircase like a cold breath. Nova thought she heard her name. She turned to Mark, who was already standing, his flashlight aimed at the darkened hallway. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, but neither of them moved. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, the voice came again. This time it was clearer. A man's voice, hoarse and deliberate, calling out, "Nova!" Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded like it knew her. Mark decided to investigate, his rational mind refusing to accept what they all feared. He climbed the stairs slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nova stayed at the base of the stairs, clutching Mia and Noah close to her. But as Mark reached the landing, he froze. His light fell on a figure standing in the hallway, a man, impossibly tall, his features obscured in shadow. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring. Mark blinked, and in that split second the figure vanished. The hallway was empty again, but the air felt heavy, charged with something unnatural. He stumbled back down the stairs, his face ashen. "There's someone here," he managed to say. "We need to leave." Nova grabbed her phone to call for help, but the screen remained dark, unresponsive. She tried the cabin's landline, but there was no dial tone. "What about the car?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded and hurried to grab the keys, but when he opened the front door, the scene outside stopped him in his tracks. The path leading to their car was gone, buried under a thick layer of fresh snow that hadn't been there an hour ago. And standing at the edge of the forest, just visible in the moonlight, was the same tall figure Mark had seen upstairs. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching. Panic set in. Nova locked the door and pulled the children close. Mark checked every window, every possible exit, but the cabin felt more like a trap with each passing minute. Even the familiar warmth of the fireplace now seemed alien, its light casting shapes that made Nova's skin crawl. As they huddled together, the voice came again. This time it was louder, clearer, and closer. "Nova! Mark! Come upstairs!" Noah began to cry, and Mia clung to her mother, her small hands trembling. Mark grabbed the fire poker, his face set in grim determination, but even he didn't know what they were up against. "What's the first thing you'd do if you thought you were being haunted or followed? Would you try to fight or would you run? Let me know in the comments, because for the Prescotts, running wasn't an option, and fighting felt like a losing battle. What had started as subtle, unsettling oddities now erupted into something far more threatening. The Prescotts were no longer debating whether they were imagining things. They were trapped, facing a force they couldn't understand, let alone fight. And the cabin, the one place they thought was safe, seemed to be turning against them. It began with the banging, first on the front door, then the windows, then the walls. Heavy, deliberate blows that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Mark shouted over the noise, trying to reassure Nova and the kids, but his own voice trembled. He tried to open the door, desperate to face whatever was out there, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was holding them in. As Mark struggled with the door, Nova noticed something on the walls. At first, she thought it was the flickering light playing tricks on her, but as she stepped closer, her stomach dropped. Symbols etched into the wood were appearing in real time, as if an invisible hand were carving them. She reached out to touch one, a crude spiral surrounded by jagged lines, but jerked her hand back when it burned to the touch. The family wasn't alone anymore. Shadows moved across the room, impossible shapes that didn't match the light source. Mark turned abruptly, swearing he'd seen someone standing at the foot of the stairs. When he shone his flashlight, the beam caught a fleeting glimpse of a face, hollow eyes, a mouth twisted in an unnatural grin, but it vanished before he could say anything. Noah and Mia screamed as their toys began moving on their own. A small red ball rolled across the floor, stopping at Mark's feet. The sound of whispers filled the room, unintelligible but relentless, growing louder and louder until Mark shouted at the top of his lungs, "Stop it!" For a moment, the room fell silent, but only for a moment. Nova, desperate for answers, began searching the cabin. She rifled through drawers, overturned furniture, and opened every cabinet she could find. In the small office room near the back of the cabin, she found it, an old dusty journal hidden behind a stack of weathered books. The cover was cracked leather, and the pages were filled with spidery handwriting. The entries described the cabin's original owner, a man named Richard Ellison. Ellison had lived alone in the cabin for decades, a recluse known for his strange behavior. But the journal revealed something darker. In one entry, dated December 31st, 1953, he wrote, "The clock strikes 12 tonight, and I'll meet them again. They promised me I'd never be alone, but the price grows heavier each year. I've tried to warn others, but they never listen. The house chooses its own." Nova's hands shook as she read. The journal ended abruptly with a final, chilling sentence. "Midnight approaches. They are coming for me, but they will stay for you." As Nova rushed to show Mark the journal, the banging started again. Louder this time, more frantic. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsating in time with the pounding. Mark tried to calm Noah and Mia, but his voice was drowned out by a high-pitched screech that seemed to come from the very air around them. The fire in the fireplace roared suddenly, casting eerie shapes across the room. A figure appeared in the flames, a twisted silhouette with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift and warp. Nova screamed, dropping the journal, but when Mark turned to look, the figure was gone. Only the firelight remained, crackling innocently as if nothing had happened. Mark grabbed the fire poker again, his knuckles white as he moved toward the windows. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm. But when he pulled back the curtains, the forest outside seemed different, closer, darker, and more alive. The snow-covered path was gone, replaced by thick, gnarled tree roots that stretched toward the cabin like claws. Nova tried the front door again, but it was sealed shut, the lock jammed as if welded in place. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing with cruel laughter. And then a single voice rose above the others, deep and commanding. "You can't leave. It's almost time." Nova clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. The symbols on the walls, the whispers, the figure in the fire. They were all connected to this Richard Ellison and whatever bargain he had made decades ago. But why them? Why tonight? She glanced at the clock. It was 11:47. Time was running out. What would you do if you found something that connected your location to a chilling event? Would you stay to investigate, or would you risk everything to escape? Tell me in the comments, because the Prescotts were running out of choices and running out of time. The Prescotts had been pushed to their limits. Trapped in a cabin that felt more alive and hostile than ever, they were running out of time, options, and hope. But Nova's discovery of the journal provided one thing they hadn't had before: answers. And those answers were more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. Richard Ellison's journal was more than a record. It was a warning. As Nova read the entries aloud to Mark, Noah, and Mia, the pieces began to fall into place. Ellison had made a pact, desperate for companionship after years of solitude. He had called out to the unknown, and something had answered. But the companionship he sought came with a price. Each year on New Year's Eve, he had to offer a piece of himself to the entities he had summoned. The final entry described his refusal to comply. That decision, he wrote, condemned the cabin and anyone who stayed within its walls to an endless cycle of torment. The Prescotts weren't just bystanders. They were now part of that cycle. Her hands shook as she held the journal. Tears welled in her eyes as guilt set in. "I brought us here," she whispered. "I thought it would be magical." Her voice cracked as she looked at her terrified children. Mark's jaw tightened. Anger flickered in his eyes as he grabbed the journal. "This isn't our fault," he said, his voice low but firm. "We didn't choose this." Noah, clutching his sister protectively, asked, "Mom, is it because we played upstairs? Did we wake it up?" Nova and Mark exchanged a glance, the weight of their children's fear sinking into their hearts. They had to find a way out. But the journal offered no solutions, only an ominous countdown to midnight. The journal revealed more than just Ellison's story. It described events that mirrored what the Prescotts were experiencing. The symbols on the walls weren't random. They were marks left behind by the entities to seal their victims inside. The whispers were their way of taunting, wearing down their prey. And the figure in the woods? That was Ellison, or what was left of him, a reminder of what awaited those who defied the pact. Nova's mind raced as she remembered her mother's warnings from years ago. The stories about the cabin weren't just folklore. They were based on what had happened to her uncle, a man who had gone missing on New Year's Eve decades earlier. The realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't just random. Her family had been connected to this place all along. As the clock struck 11:55, the cabin seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, and the fireplace erupted in a burst of sparks. The air grew heavy, making it hard to breathe. Shadows coalesced into forms, circling the family with an almost predatory intent. And then the door to the upstairs creaked open. Standing at the top of the stairs was the figure. This time it didn't vanish. It descended slowly, its movements deliberate, its eyes fixed on Nova. Its voice, deep, echoing, and filled with malice, spoke. "You're the one who brought them here. You must decide." Nova froze, her mind racing as the figure continued to descend. She realized it wasn't just speaking to her, it was giving her a choice. The journal had hinted at this, an opportunity to break the cycle or succumb to it. But what did it want, and what price would they have to pay? Mark grabbed the fire poker, positioning himself between the figure and his family. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if amused by Mark's defiance. It raised a long, shadowy hand, and the room plunged into darkness. The sound of banging returned, louder and more chaotic, as if the cabin itself was tearing apart. Nova clutched the journal, frantically flipping through the pages for some kind of answer. And then she saw it, a phrase she hadn't noticed before, scrawled in the margin of the final entry. "Light breaks the curse." She looked around, her eyes landing on the fireplace, now reduced to embers. "The lantern!" she shouted, pointing to an old oil lantern on the mantel. Mark understood instantly, grabbing it and fumbling with the matches in his pocket. As he struck a flame, the figure lunged forward, its shadowy form stretching toward Nova and the children. The lantern ignited, flooding the room with a warm, golden light. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The symbols on the walls began to fade, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly. But the clock continued to tick. It was 11:58. The Prescotts weren't safe yet. The shadows still loomed, circling the room as the figure snarled, its form twisting in agony. Nova held the lantern high, its light casting long beams across the walls. "We need to keep it burning," she shouted, her voice filled with both fear and determination. But the lantern's oil was running low. Mark tore through the cabinets, searching for anything flammable, while Noah and Mia huddled together, their small faces pale with terror. Nova turned back to the figure, now only feet away. Its voice boomed, "You cannot escape. The clock will strike, and you will be mine." Nova's mind raced. There was one thing left to try. She grabbed the journal and hurled it into the fire. The pages ignited instantly, the flames roaring back to life. The light grew blinding, forcing the figure to retreat. With a deafening scream, it dissolved into smoke, the shadows dissipating into the walls. And then, silence. The Prescotts stood in stunned silence, the weight of the ordeal crashing down on them. They had survived, but at what cost? Nova looked at her children, at Mark, and then at the clock. Midnight had passed, but the cabin felt different, quieter, calmer. For now they were safe, but as they stepped outside into the cold night air, they couldn't shake the feeling that something, somewhere, was still watching. If you discovered you were connected to a chilling past event, how would you handle it? Would you confront it, as the Prescotts did, or leave it alone? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the answers we seek come at a price. As dawn broke over the forest, the Prescotts emerged from the cabin, alive, but forever changed. The horror of the night had ended, but the memories of what they had endured would linger. The cabin stood behind them, silent and still, as if it had never been the source of such terror. But they knew better. The Prescotts didn't waste time. As soon as the first light of day broke through the dense canopy, they packed their belongings in silence. The air outside was cold, but it felt lighter, freer. Nova and Mark worked quickly, their movements efficient but tense. The children clung to each other, too exhausted to ask questions, but their wide, watchful eyes betrayed the fear still lingering within them. Before leaving, Nova made one last decision. She stood at the edge of the porch, looking back at the cabin. Her mind raced with everything she had read in the journal. Ellison's warnings, his despair, and his final act of defiance. Without a word, she walked to the side of the cabin, pulled out a piece of charcoal from the embers in the fireplace, and marked a large X across the front door. She didn't know if it would mean anything, but it felt right. It felt like closure. The drive back to the city was tense. Mark kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if expecting the figure to follow them. Nova held Noah and Mia close in the back seat, whispering reassurances neither of them fully believed. When they reached the nearest town, they stopped at a diner. It was here that Nova decided to share part of their story. The local sheriff, a grizzled man in his 60s, listened intently as Nova recounted their night. His expression didn't change, but when she mentioned the name Richard Ellison, his eyes narrowed. "Ellison's cabin?" he asked, leaning forward. "You're lucky to be alive. Most folks who spend the night there, well, let's just say they don't leave in one piece." The sheriff explained that over the years, multiple disappearances had been tied to the cabin, always on New Year's Eve. Locals avoided it, calling it cursed. When Nova asked why nothing had been done, the sheriff shrugged. "Some things you can't fix," he said, "and some places, they don't want to be fixed." Back home, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an ordeal. Mark threw himself into work, using the distraction to cope. Nova began journaling, documenting every detail of their night at the cabin in the hopes that someone, someday, might find it useful. Noah and Mia rarely spoke of it, but they refused to sleep with the lights off. Nova often found herself replaying the events of that night, wondering what they could have done differently. She couldn't shake the feeling that their connection to the cabin wasn't over. She dreamed of it often, dreams filled with whispers, flickering shadows, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the figure. Months later, as Nova sat in her living room one quiet evening, she felt a familiar chill. She looked up to see Noah standing in the doorway, holding something in his hand. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling, "I found this in my backpack." He held up a small, charred piece of paper. Nova's heart sank as she recognized the spidery handwriting of Richard Ellison. The paper was blank except for one line, scrawled in the center, "It isn't over." The Prescotts had escaped the cabin, but the events of that night refused to let them go. Whether it was a curse, a warning, or something else entirely, they didn't know. But one thing was certain: some doors, once open, can never be fully closed. If you were in Nova's shoes, would you try to find out more, or would you leave the past behind? Let me know in the comments. And remember, not all stories end when the clock strikes midnight. The story of the Prescotts reminds us of a harsh truth. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and even the most joyous occasions can turn into something far more unsettling. Traditions, places, and even seemingly innocent objects can hold memories we may never fully understand. And as much as we try to escape them, some doors once opened leave a permanent crack in the fabric of our lives. What happened to the Prescotts may seem unimaginable, but stories like these have a way of lingering in the shadows of our minds. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, a moment when the world didn't feel quite right, when you couldn't shake the feeling that you weren't alone. If so, I'd love to hear your story. If you enjoyed this story, share it with a friend who loves horror. Your support helps us uncover even more chilling tales to share with you. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new, terrifying journey. And now I want to ask you, do you have any horror stories of your own? Maybe a strange event that stuck with you, or a moment that sent shivers down your spine? Drop them in the comments. I might feature your story in a future video. Until then, stay safe, and don't ignore the whispers.